Hello, I'm Jim MacDonald from the Economic Research Service, and today I'm going to talk about how the ARMS data is used in a variety of different ways. I'm going to talk about three major ways in which it's used that we do, particularly at ERS. First, I'm going to talk about financial reporting that ERS does that relies heavily on the ARMS data and also includes a significant number of different data releases that we make quickly after processing the data. Second, I'm going to give several examples of policy-related ERS reports that we post on our website and make available to all. Third, I will give you several examples of custom reports that we do for specific members of Congress and the administration, sometimes called staff analyses, that we do on a very quick turnaround basis in response to very specific requests. Let me start with our financial reporting. In our November release, which was our most recent release for our forecast of farm income, we forecast that net farm income for the agricultural sector would be $114 billion in 2012, down 3% from 2011. As you can see from the chart, we track our estimates of net farm income from 2000 through 2012 in the red line. The blue line shows trends in net cash income, and the two dashed lines show the 10-year averages for each of those. As you can tell, although 2012 net cash income is down compared to 2011, each of those years are well above the historic average. Now, that's the forecast. We also, at the same time we provide a forecast of what will happen, we provide estimates of what did happen in, for example, 2011, using the ARMS data. We provide those estimates and forecasts for the big headline numbers, net farm income, as well as for component expense and revenue items. We do it for the farm sector, for farm businesses, and for farm households. The ARMS provides about 3/4 of the data used in what we call the farm sector accounts. Now, in 2012, as in 2011, there were really striking regional differences, though, in our forecast. Recall, we forecast that net farm income would decline by about 3.3% in 2012. If you look at the map shown in this slide, we see that in what's called the Northern Crescent, New England and the upper Midwest, we're forecasting declines in net cash income of 10%. In the Fruitful Rim, the areas in the West Coast and in the far southeast in Florida and southern Texas, we're forecasting declines of 13% in net cash income. On the other hand, as you look through in areas like the northern Great Plains and the Delta region, that is what we call the Mississippi Portal in our reporting, we are forecasting declines of well over 20%. So there are very large differences across the country in our estimates of net cash income. As we'll see, they're tied to an important extent to the commodity basis of what's produced in those areas. Now, our estimates are made first to the Secretary. That's our first conference presenting it. It's also picked up quickly by the media, by people on the Hill, and by lots of farm groups. These are used for policy purposes, and they're used in much farm bill discussions and in analyses of what sorts of policy we think may be needed for the agricultural sector. But it's not just about policy. These types of reports are important for lenders, for input providers, and for producers and corporate boards. Lenders look very closely at financial performance of the sector to try to think about where the risks lie in lending and what sorts of guidelines they ought to be using in making their lending decisions. For input providers, equipment purchases are closely tied to movements in net farm, net cash income in the farm sector, and therefore equipment providers look closely at this to think about production plans and inventory decisions for the coming year. For chemical, seed, and feed demand, that's less closely tied to movements in net income. Nonetheless, it is tied to a degree, and other ARMS data also is used for those producers to think carefully about their production decisions, their inventory decisions, and where they should set up their distribution networks. Finally, for producers and for boards of cooperatives, these financial reports give a great deal of information for use in deciding where to invest what types of commodities, what types of structures or equipment people ought to be looking at. So these are widely used for decision making in the private sector as well as in the public sector. An important point to bear in mind is that the value of this information is growing. It's growing precisely because prices are becoming far less predictable. What you see in this chart are the August prices paid or received that NASS reports for each of 5 years, 2008 through 2012. The top rows show corn, soybeans, and winter wheat. The lower rows show those movements for hogs, milk, and anhydrous ammonia. As you can see, prices fluctuate dramatically. 2012 corn prices were double their level in 2010. Soybeans and winter wheat show similar sharp fluctuations. For the livestock-related products, hogs and milk we're showing here, those prices fluctuate sharply, but bear in mind, corn and soybeans are a primary expense for those producers, and therefore their expenses are fluctuating quite sharply as well. And the bottom row, anhydrous ammonia prices fell nearly 60% from 2008 through 2010, and then nearly doubled from 2010 through 2012. That's a key ingredient in fertilizer. So we see dramatic movements in prices over time. We have every reason to expect this kind of variability to continue. Now, that variability in itself makes it harder to predict and assess farm finances, but there are other things that make it very hard to predict from prices alone. There are significant cross-farm differences in the structure of their expenses and in the ways in which they purchase their inputs. That affects their prices and affects their costs and ultimately affects the estimates of their financial performance. There are significant differences across farms in the nature of government support and in the household resources available to them. All of those make it very difficult to predict farm financial performance on the basis of prices alone, and therefore implies a greater need for objective information on the sort of baseline financial accounts, income statements and balance sheets that are provided out of the ARMS data and ERS farm financial reporting. Now, this year, we did a lot of reporting closely tied to the drought. That clearly was going to affect our evaluation of farm finances as we went through the year. Initially, where we worked was to try to tie where the drought was hitting to where farm production was occurring so that we could get a good gross sense initially of how big we thought the impact would be. The chart here uses USDA weather data to sort the counties of the country into 4 different categories according to the severity of the drought that they faced, from minimal drought all the way up to extreme drought or worse. What we then did was tie this to ARMS data so we could clearly understand how much of corn or wheat or soybean production was in extreme drought areas. As you can see from this chart, nearly half of corn and soybean production was in extreme drought areas, and relatively small amounts, 10%, were in minimal drought areas. Those crops were hard hit by the drought. By contrast, nearly 40% of wheat production was in areas of minimal drought impact. So we were able to use this in real time through the summer to track where we thought the financial impacts would occur. We could do this as well for livestock. What we have here is livestock production sorted according to the same 4 categories of drought. And what you see here is that the red bar, cattle production, was about half of cattle production was in severe drought areas. In contrast, relatively little dairy production was in severe drought areas. However, the direct effects of drought on production are not the major issue facing livestock producers. The major problem for livestock producers occurs through feed prices, and therefore the impact on their expenses. For us to figure out the likely impact of changes in feed prices on expenses and therefore farm financial performance, we need to know not only the likely change in feed prices, which we could estimate, but we also need to know how important feed is in the expenses of these different livestock operations. Where can we find that information? Well, in fact, that's a significant part of what comes out of ARMS. In this year, for you enumerators, it's Section 26 out of expenses, and Sections 2 to 25 where we build up gross income. We have several reports that NASS and ERS produce that provides us with detailed information on the expense structure of different types of farms. We can use this information to project the likely impact of feed price changes on expenses and on net income for different types of farms. For example, we have a chart here comparing corn farm businesses to dairy farm businesses. The measure we're using is the percent of farm businesses that have negative net cash income in each of these years. That is, their revenues are less than their expenses. It's a nice, clean measure. We have many others. This works well in a short chart presentation. We have sorted farms according to, again, those 4 different drought categories. Those are in counties with minimal drought all the way up to those that happen to be in counties with extreme drought or worse. And what we're doing in the red bars is projecting 2012 net cash farm income, and in the blue bars, the actual 2011 net cash income. And so the comparison of the bars shows our projected change in the percent of farms that we expect to experience negative net cash income. Notice, first on the corn side, for those farms that are in counties with minimal drought issues, the percent with negative net cash income decline. Their financial performance we expect to improve. The reason for that is those farms have corn with little drought, and prices for corn rose sharply. Those farms were going to do a lot better in 2012 than in 2011. What's interesting is if you look at the bars for corn under extreme drought or worse, there's very little change. The reason why there's very little change is that most of these farms are covered by crop insurance. We can estimate coverage, again, using the ARMS data. So the financial impact of the drought on corn businesses was not particularly severe. In fact, many of them were better off. If by contrast we look at dairy businesses, notice the red bars are far above the blue in every drought category. With sharp increases in expenses, far more of those farms were moving into categories of net cash farm income losses. And dairy businesses in that case took a very strong hit from the drought through the impact of higher feed prices. Now, one more point. We compared dairy to other livestock businesses. And here we compare for each of those categories, we have bars for each of 5 years that reflect average net cash income for farms in those categories. And we compare them from 2008 through our 2012 forecast. Notice, for example, for poultry, there's very little change through that time. For hogs, they had a strong peak performance in 2010 and a decline after that, but there's no decline in 2012 compared to 2011. By contrast, there's a very large decline in average net cash income for dairy. The reason for this is another characteristic of these farms. Most poultry and hog producers produce under contract and have their feed provided for them by their contractors. For that reason, it is an expense to their contractors who bear the price risks, but it is not an expense to the contract growers in the poultry and hog business. So they are, in a sense, insulated from those price risks. Dairy producers are far more likely to be purchasing their feed and to bear the immediate impacts of changes in feed prices. For that reason, the big impact in 2012 of the drought on financial performance occurred with dairy farms. Now, let's think about the value of ARMS in this case. First, and I can't really understate this, a large part of the value arises from it being a large and representative sample. It gives us extremely accurate information for the U.S. farm sector. Secondly, it allows us to finely distinguish among different types of farms according to the structure of expenses, the source of revenue flows, the exposure to risks, and the support from different types of policies. That's one reason why it's such a difficult survey for us, because it's a large and complicated survey to get that information. But that provides us with considerable value on the other end when we're trying to analyze what's going on in the economics of the farm sector. Okay, let me shift to other uses of our financial data. Once we produce our estimates of net farm income, those numbers enter into the national economic accounts, particularly for gross domestic product. They form the agricultural component of the GDP accounts. They also enter into other measures called the state personal income and local area income estimates. I'll speak about those in a moment, but what I want to emphasize is that the gross domestic product estimates are key numbers used for measurement of the national economy and for macroeconomic policy making. They're probably the single most important measure that we use, and the agriculture component is measured accurately, quite accurately, compared to other areas of GDP accounts, in particular because we provide them with exceptionally good data out of the ARMS accounts. Now, let me briefly mention the other uses in state and local income estimates. What these essentially are estimates of total incomes closely tied to total spending in states and in what we call local areas, which may be metropolitan areas or maybe agglomerations of non-metro counties. We use those data for two major purposes. One is what's called formula allocation of federal funds. I'll mention that in a moment. And the second is for investment analyses and planning. For formula allocation, there are a number of federal programs for which Congress sets the total amount of expenditures, but the way in which they get allocated across the country to different regions is through a formula. And those state and local income estimates are part of the formulas for how we allocate those funds across the country. Medicaid comes under that type of spending allocation, so does supplemental Social Security income. Agricultural research and extension and USDA ag lending also come under those types of formula programs. For investment, both public and private, in planning, whether it's public utilities, highway investments, hospitals, or on the private side, local retail and wholesale facilities, planners use estimates of total spending and total income in local areas, as well as projected changes in those, to plan for those types of investments. They're a crucial measurement tool for thinking about how much we need to invest and how big these facilities need to be. Finally, there are a variety of uses of the data as we release it immediately through our financial accounts. For example, the Risk Management Agency of USDA uses ARMS data, particularly estimates of planting costs, to help it design crop insurance contracts and to design how we're going to set up indemnities through those contracts. For another example, fertilizer firms use estimates of fertilizer application rates directly taken from ARMS to plan demand for fertilizer in the future and therefore to plan production and inventories in order to meet that demand. ARMS is also used in a variety of damages estimates. If, for example, there's a natural disaster and Congress decides that they're going to pass some disaster relief for farms, one of the things they're going to use is ARMS estimates of the impact on net farm income for farm businesses in order to estimate how much money they're going to provide. All right, in these cases, let me just briefly mention again the value of ARMS-based financial reporting. It is not the only information source for users. These stakeholders, private and public, often have other sources that they use, including information that they generate on their own and that they may get from university programs. But ARMS is distinct and unique in that it is large-scale, comprehensive, and representative. That provides it with a strength that everybody wants to access. As a result, these stakeholders, even though they have often their own information, they're going to use ARMS numbers. They're going to use it sometimes in their own forecasts, but they're also going to use it to compare their forecasts to ARMS forecasts. So it's used very broadly, both directly and for comparison purposes. Okay, That's what we do with our financial reporting. We also produce a series of research reports in which we take the data and we do a lot more analysis and modeling. These reports are posted on our website and released for anybody to use. We show a series of covers of these reports on this slide. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes is just talk about two of these types of reports. One is a long-standing research program that we've had that's been aimed at analyzing the dramatic changes in how we organize hog production in the United States. That's a program for our research purposes that's been going on for several years. Secondly, I'll talk about another research program that is in progress right now and for which we'll soon be releasing a report. All right, let me start and talk about hog production a bit. In the last 2 decades, there's been a dramatic transformation of hog production. While total production is up by 40 to 50% in those 20 years, the number of hog farms has declined by about 70%. As a result, hog farms have gotten much larger. We've also had dramatic changes in how the business is organized. We rarely now sell hogs through cash markets. Much of it is done through a tightly controlled contracting process. ERS has produced a series of reports relying on ARMS data to assess the drivers of that transformation, to describe it, to assess its impacts on costs and productivity and prices in the industry, and to assess the impacts on environmental outcomes. These studies have been used by industry, by policymakers, and by lenders for a fundamental understanding of the changing economics of the industry. And what I'm going to do is give you just a few charts that describe some of the work we've done. One of our early findings was that scale economies mattered in hog production. That is, that costs per hog produced fell very sharply as you got to larger and larger farms. The chart here shows number of head removed from a farm, measure of the size of the hog enterprise, and compares it to production costs per hundredweight using our most recent data from 2009. It does it for the 2 major ways in which we produce hogs, that is, separately for feeder to finish farms and for farrow to finish farms. And what you can see is that those costs decline and decline substantially as you get to larger farms. That's a driving force in the change in structure towards much larger farms. You can reduce your costs and make more money with a larger farm, and we've had a dramatic change in structure in that way. The other chart compares contract operations to independents and uses data that we analyzed in the 90s at a time when production was first starting to shift to contract operations. And it compares output per unit of input, that is output per unit of feed, per unit of labor, per unit of capital, and total output per units of inputs, and compares the performance of contract to independent operations. And what we found then was that contract operations had much higher levels of productivity on average than independents. And primarily we were able to establish that that was because they were more quickly moving newer production practices and new technologies into the industry that allowed them to realize those gains. What does that mean for the industry as a whole? Well, in these charts we analyzed trends in the industry over time in feed efficiency and in labor efficiency. And the way we represent it in this chart is the improvement from 1992 in feed efficiency, which essentially as an improvement means the reduction in the amount of feed needed for a given 100 pounds of weight gain. And what you can see is there are very sharp improvements after 1992, and particularly between 1992 and 2004 in feed efficiency, particularly among feeder to finish operations. Those are close to 60% improvements compared to where they had been in 1992. Separately, we measured improvements in labor efficiency. Again, this is measured as the reduction in the amount of hours needed for a given amount of hog production, measured by hundredweight gain. And again, here you can see very sharp improvements after 1992. Those improvements mean that we wind up using a lot less inputs, that is inputs of feed and inputs of labor, for a given amount of hog production. And in turn, that means that costs of production would be declining as we shifted both to larger operations and over time. That shows up in this chart. That improved productivity leads to declining real costs of hog production. Here we're showing average production costs per hundredweight, adjusted for changes in input prices, that is adjusted for inflation, and we're tracking them over time from 1992 through 2009. And what we can see is substantial declines over time in costs of production, which in turn are tied to declines over time in real wholesale prices for pork and to a more minor extent to retail prices. Now, the outcome of this turned out to be most important in international trade. This is a chart that measures certain types of outcomes in the hog business. The dashed line shows trends in total production, which increases in about a 20-year period by around 40%. The lower red line shows the share of production that goes to exports. Originally, in the late 80s, that was around 2 or 3% of U.S. production. By today, it's around 20%. So we've had a substantial increase in exports of pork over that period. And finally, the middle line shows exports as a percent of total trade, exports plus imports. It's a standard measure of competitiveness. And what it shows you, if you look closely, is that earlier in the period, we were heavy importers of pork. By later in the period, we'd become major exporters of pork. And the reason is that because of that dramatic structural change in the industry, hog production costs in the United States had fallen compared to other countries, and it became a major export item for us. Now, what's the value of arms research for this type of issue? There was no arms data in the slide I just showed you about market incomes. Those are standard numbers that are presented from industry data. What arms data does is help explain why and how those outcomes happened. It gives us detailed evidence to be able to choose among different hypotheses, to understand which policies mattered and which didn't, to be able to understand what types of private decisions mattered. It also helps us understand where we're likely to go in the future. One of the things that I did not mention in those charts, but it's clear when you take a close look at the subtleties, is that most of those scale economies have now been realized. Costs are unlikely to fall much more as farms get larger from where they are now. Furthermore, the gains in efficiency were starting to diminish late in the period. Again, most of the new innovations had been spread widely through the industry by 2009. That leads us to believe that the period of dramatic improvement in productivity costs is over, and we expect only more modest changes and more modest changes in structure into the future. There's a little bit more on this. There are important areas of environmental performance associated with this. The tremendous improvements in feed efficiency means that we actually produce a lot less manure per hog than we did in the past. But the increase in the size of production units and the concentration geographically mean that we now consolidate manure in narrower geographic areas. And with that, we also consolidate some environmental risks. During the period, we've had responses to that through increased regulation. What ARMS is able to show over that period is how farmers responded to that regulation, and we're able to identify those practices that support responsible manure management in the hog industry. Let me touch on a second current issue, which is the use of animal antibiotics, which are widely used throughout the hog and poultry industries. Many retailers now want pork raised without growth-promoting antibiotics. In fact, almost every major retailer has a branded pork product with that label on it. What we can do with ARMS is track current usage. We can track the impact of different types of antibiotics uses on productivity and costs. We can type the types of practices that people use when they're not using growth-promoting antibiotics. We have had strong support from the National Pork Producers Council for these types of questions. In particular, because both the environmental and antibiotic side, these are very sensitive issues for respondents, and they're very poorly understood by many people in the country. ARMS provides objective facts on issues that are often poorly understood. And the survey analyses that we provide can also point the way for how producers deal with new regulatory and in particular new retailer requirements that they face as the industry changes. That's what we've done on hogs. Our emerging issue is work on glyphosate resistance. Glyphosate is a herbicide that's widely applied to crops, to emergent crops. It kills weeds, it doesn't kill the corn or soybeans or cotton. It's closely tied to genetically engineered seeds for corn, soybeans, and cotton because they have been engineered to be tolerant of glyphosate in particular. Glyphosate has had an important impact on yields and on production. However, increasingly, weeds are growing resistant to glyphosate. That is, it doesn't kill them. I have a picture in the lower corner of a particular type of glyphosate-resistant pigweed. Now, resistance leads to falling yields, increasing costs, falling net returns, and I might also add that the chemical substitutes for glyphosate, other herbicides, tend to be much more toxic and dangerous for those applying it and tend to have stronger environmental impacts. So it's a significant both social and financial problem, and it's a problem that's spreading. Where does ARMS fit in? Well, we're in a sense on top of this issue. We had questions on glyphosate resistance in the Phase 2 corn survey, and we have them in the Phase 2 soybean survey this year. ARMS is particularly important here. It's a large and representative sample, as opposed to what we have aside from ARMS is anecdotes and samples that are not representative. So we don't have really good information on the importance and extent of resistance. But in addition, with ARMS, we collect data on other types of practices that might impact resistance and pest control. We have information on the types of crops that are being grown, on the types of rotations that are being used, and the other types of herbicides that are being applied. That allows us to narrow down the particular impacts of resistance to glyphosate. Furthermore, through the ARMS, because we collect data on yields, revenues, and expenses, we can assess the financial impacts of glyphosate resistance on farm financial performance. Now, let me add, just this past summer, I happened to be in the back of the room at a meeting of many of the top economic experts on glyphosate and on genetically engineered crops. And there's a great deal of discussion about the importance of resistance and agreement that it seemed important, but we didn't know the true extent and we didn't have a good sense of the best options for dealing with it. But there is also consensus among these people that, well, when they got the 2012 ARMS data, they would know a lot more. That's the core information for them to use in assessing impacts and likely responses. And let me go from there to say that that data can and will be used to assess policy and control options. At the farm level, we use that data to model the best pest control options given the existence of resistance to glyphosate. Now, an important aspect of what farmers can do here is that actions that individual farmers take can also provide benefits to other farmers. For that opens the way to potential policy decisions here. Because it leads us to think about whether we should subsidize some farmers' behavior because it generates benefits not only for that farmer, but for others as they follow certain strategies designed to deal with glyphosate resistance. In particular, we may be able to design new practices and fund new practices through the EQIP program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program that USDA currently uses to obtain conservation goals and environmental goals on working farms. We use ARMS to model the design of that program and think at how it might be best designed to handle glyphosate resistance. Now, all right, those are our two major areas of research reports that I wanted to talk about. We also do a series of custom reports with ARMS, that is directly for policymakers in USDA or in Congress. We don't release those reports, although sometimes if we think it is an important and widespread question, we may generate one of our public reports out of that. It's generally a very focused analysis of specific issues with a very quick response. Reliable and respected data are crucial to doing these analyses and crucial for the confidence that policymakers have in this when they ask us to do these analyses. I'm going to give you two examples. One is an old one that you've seen me give before. There was a proposal in the last Farm Bill debates, that is in the 2007 Farm Bill, to limit eligibility for the EQIP program. That is, as I said, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program that's used to encourage the use of certain conservation and environmental practices on farms. The proposal was to limit EQIP spending only to those applicants who derived at least 2/3 of their household income from farming. They sent a request to ERS. What would the impact be if we actually implemented this proposal? Now think for a minute first why policymakers would want to limit eligibility. The key reason is they're concerned that we've got lots of people who don't do much farming who are eligible for these numbers. And it seemed nice to them to define that as, well, people that don't get most of their income from farming. So we took a look at it. We generated the following table using ARMS data. That is, we sorted ARMS EQIP recipients, people who are already in the program, this was in 2006. We sorted them into three categories. Those that got at least 2/3 of their household income from farming. Those were the people that would still be eligible under this proposal. Another category was people that got between 0 and 66%, or 2/3 of their income from farming. They would be ineligible. And a third category would be people who got less than 0, that is a negative proportion of their household income from farming. Essentially, most of those are people with losses from farming. They would also be ineligible under the current proposal. When we looked at this, we found that, well, the proposal would eliminate most recipients. Now, from the point of view of the people making the proposal, that might be a good thing. We could target the money more closely to the people we thought might be real farmers. And those people that would be eliminated from the program received actually most payments, 52%. But when you look more closely at what those people do, and we can see it in the table here, together the two groups that would be eliminated accounted for 44% of all the production that was carried out by farmers getting EQIP. And if you look at their average farm sales, it was well over 200,000 each. They are not, by and large, small or hobby farmers. They tend to be people who either have losses in a given year from farming, sometimes because they haven't realized revenues yet, or they tend to be people with off-farm jobs and small to mid-sized commercial farming operations. Now, let's sit back and think a little bit about this analysis, and this is why I pick it up each year. How did ARMS help us, and what parts of ARMS did we need? Well, it helped us by enabling us to zero in very closely on the particular issue at hand. But what's more, we used almost all sections of ARMS to do this. We needed that section at the end on household income to be able to directly get at the policy question involved. We also needed all those sections on revenues and expenses in order to generate estimates of net income from farming. And finally, we needed the sections on government payments to help us identify those farms that were in the EQIP program, and the sections on production to help us estimate how much production fell into these different categories. So we used the entire survey to get at this particular important question. Another point to ask is, well, why did they need us? Why did congressional staff need this help? And it's important to bear in mind, many of the staff on the Agriculture Committee have farm backgrounds. They have much more direct farm experience than I have. But their backgrounds tend to be very specific to the experience they had growing up on a farm or the experience their family had. It doesn't extend very widely for most of them, and very few of them have a strong grasp of farm income accounting. So our data gives them a much broader sense of agriculture to work with than they can gain from their own experience. These issues come up time and time again In the 2012 Farm Bill discussions, there's a continuing important issue about program eligibility and who should be eligible for various types of commodity or conservation programs. In this year, we've had proposals to restrict eligibility for commodity payments by upper income individuals. In particular, to say if you have farm income over a certain amount, we will make you ineligible for commodity payments, or alternatively a separate limit for income from non-farm sources. The goals are fairly obvious. They aim at equity issues, that is, why should we extend commodity program support to extremely affluent households, and they aim at budget concerns that we are clearly under as we develop the Farm Bill. We were asked to use ARMS data to identify for a particular proposal how many people would be affected. This proposal would deny commodity payments to farm households with farm incomes of $750,000 or more in a year. We're able to use the ARMS data pretty quickly to identify how many recipients might fall under that category and how much of total payments. We show the evidence here in this chart using data from 2009. And what we can see is it's less than 5% of payments would fall under that, would be affected by that particular proposal. We're able to respond quickly as people vary proposals and try to ask us, well, what might happen with alternatives? All right, let's talk a little bit now about what's new in ARMS 2012. Not much, really, because we're also doing the census, and that imposes a lot of demands on our survey. But we do have now an integrated census ARMS form. So in our training schools, we need to pay attention to how that survey form is changed compared to a normal ARMS year. The other new thing we're doing that I've referred to briefly before is an updated soybean cost of production version. Those cost of production estimates are used to help set parameters of commodity programs. The detail we get in them on expenses for soybean production allows for analyses of the impacts of energy, fuel, and chemical price changes on costs and returns, and we use those quite frequently. And finally, the detail that we obtain from Phase 2 on practices, including glyphosate resistance, are important for both input providers planning and for analyses of efficiency and productivity growth in soybean production and for analyses of specific policy programs. All right, I've had some of my staffers tell me that what we need to do is give a whole single slide on what it is that ARMS does. And this is that slide. Major uses and users of ARMS data. We provide you again with a summary here of the 3 channels in which we provide the data. We then give a list of the different types of uses. It's used for ag policy and farm bills. We use it as a component of the gross domestic product estimates. It's used to allocate tax dollars. It's used to generate crop insurance and disaster damage estimates. It's used by lenders, manufacturers, suppliers, and retailers for many business decisions. Used by farm commodity groups for analysis and for advocacy. And finally, we've made great strides over the years in making this data available to all through our web tool on the ERS website. All right, let me summarize with a few key points. First, something I mentioned before, but it's important to mention it again. Why is ARMS valuable? It's valuable for all those things that makes it difficult for us in running the survey. That is, it's representative, it's comprehensive and objective. It is the only source out there that can say that. It is also the only source out there that links enterprises, whole farms, and the household. It tracks income and balance sheet items, and we can track those income and balance sheet items back to production and marketing decisions, which is what makes it a valuable tool for policy analysis and for business planning. The value comes from a full team. From ERS for our ability to do objective analyses and our economic expertise, from NAS for their survey design, their expertise in survey management and in production of databases, from you, our NASDA enumerators, for your extraordinary ability to get producers to cooperate and to provide guidance to them and to provide ground truthing to ERS and NAS designers of the questionnaires. Finally, from the producers themselves for their time and knowledge and thoughtfulness in responding to the survey. And the last key point I always make in these presentations is to try to remind you that policy decisions, which is ultimately what ARMS is about, even though it has a lot of private sector uses, but policy decisions are going to be made with or without ARMS. Those policymakers that are making the decisions, some have farm backgrounds, but very few of them. Even those that have farm backgrounds really can't rely on just their background and experience because it tends to be narrow. In addition, they're all very busy. They need to rely on others for information. ARMS provides accurate data on U.S. agriculture, and we believe that better information makes for better decisions. Now, for additional information, I refer you to the Phase 3 Interviewer's Manual that we have available, to the ERS website. On that website, we have the ARMS topic page that gives a great deal of detailed background on it. I also have listed here my email address and phone number. And finally, a series of links to our financial reporting sites if you're interested in more information on that sort of thing. Thank you for your time.